And welcome back to yet another edition of the I Prefer the 80s and 90s Sports Podcast, where I, Richard Harris Jr., talk about why I prefer the sports of the 80s and 90s to today. So yet another baseball season where the team with the best record is not going to win the World Series. Did it happen a lot more in the 80s and 90s? I don't recall. But I think it did. I mean, there were some upsets. There were some great series that happened in the 80s and 90s. But definitely the last 3 years in the National League, with the Giants, the Dodgers, and the Braves, the last 3 years not winning the World Series and losing kind of unceremoniously in the playoffs. And people are all speculating as to why. Too many rounds, teams that are beating them are coming in fresh off of playing, basically making rest obsolete and making rest actually a bad thing. Because you would think that you give team rest, pitchers may get a little bit more rejuvenated, bullpens get more rejuvenated, hitters get more rejuvenated because they get more time to rest their bodies. But unfortunately, it has not worked in the National League, although I think it's the competition. I think that, and as I've said, over the recent weeks, that I thought that the teams that would be more well-rested would have an advantage over the teams that are currently playing because they couldn't set up their rotations. And clearly that was a mistake, a misstatement by me, because the Phillies pitchers seem to be rejuvenated each round. I mean, Nola and Wheeler, it's funny. The Mets play the Phillies a lot over the last few years, 19 times a season. And we have good success against Nola and Wheeler. Wheeler used to be a Met. But Wheeler and Nola faces the Braves, and they look like Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale. Sandy's a lefty, of course, and neither Nola or Wheeler are lefties. But my point is, they just look like the most dominant 1-2 punch in the National League. And during the regular season, they're not. But when the Giants lost to the Dodgers in the playoffs, I mean, they both were the two best teams in baseball. And they happened to have to play each other in the first round, and it didn't work out for the Giants. Last year, the Braves ran into the same Phillies team that they ran into this year, and it didn't work out well for them. And the Dodgers last year ran into the Padres team that finally put together a good stretch of baseball and knocked them out after losing some insane amount of games to the Dodgers during the regular season. So the question, let's try to analyze. Why does this happen? I'm going to tell you why it happens. And it goes back to the 80s and 90s. The Yankees and the Red Sox used to play each other these 4-hour, sometimes 5-hour baseball games where you knew what they were going to do, they knew what you were going to do. You knew what pitch he was going to throw, they knew what pitch you were going to throw. And so there was no mystery. It just was the question of execution or being executed. And unfortunately, more times than not, the Red Sox would win some, the Yankees would win some. The Yankees would have bigger moments, the Red Sox have big moments. Until finally, in like 2004, the Red Sox had had enough and was able to somehow, some way, come from behind down 3-0 to the Yankees. The Yankees seemed to have an advantage, and that advantage, of course, was Mariano Rivera in their bullpen and John Wetland in their bullpen, because it didn't matter how often they faced those guys. The Red Sox didn't hit them well until later on, when Red Sox had players who get on base, steal the base that would distract Mariano, and then Millar or Bill Miller or some guy who wasn't one of their great players would get a hit and beat the Yankees. And so I think what has happened is that teams are so familiar with their opponents, that it's almost like they play a game and then they say, man, if I face that guy one more time, or the next time I see him, I'm going to look for this pitch. And if he throws it to me, I'm going to do something with it. And I know they've been killing this story about the 1988 World Series, where Kirk Gibson supposedly said that if he can get Eckersley to a 3-2 pitch, he knows exactly what's coming. It's going to be a backdoor slider, and he's going to hit a home run with it or whatever. He's going to do something to the pitch. And sure enough, situation came about. Eckersley kept throwing pitches, and Gibson kept fouling him off on one leg, and finally the pitch came, and boom, he hit the home run. And so maybe that's what's happening with these teams that become number one seeds, because their opponents have seen it, done it, lived it, experienced it, and during the regular season know how to handle it. And so basically, when the Braves are playing the Phillies in the playoffs, the Phillies and the Braves have intense games all the time, and the Phillies are seeing everything that the Braves have, and the Braves are seeing everything the Phillies have, but the only difference is the Phillies seem to have more relief pitchers than the Braves, or have different ones in recent years than the Braves. And so that's why I think the Phillies have beaten the Braves, because the starting pitching of the Braves, they all do the same thing. They live off fastballs and sliders and curveballs. They didn't even throw Charlie Morton in this series. And the Phillies are like, we've seen it, done it. All we got to do is execute against it, and we'll win. And they have. In the American League, it's a little bit different. In the American League, it's now Texas against Houston. The matchups are a little bit different in the American League than in the National League, because the teams that have played against each other are not teams that play against each other a lot. And so if you have better talent, as Texas has had against the American League East teams that it's faced, you tend to win. Texas has, in my opinion, the American League MVP, Corey Seager, and Marcus Semien, who played for Toronto, so he kind of has a little bit of knowledge of the American League East teams, and of course, one of them happened to be Toronto. And he knows how to attack Tampa and Baltimore, and he knows how to attack Toronto. And so they had a plan, They didn't have any pitcher that, I mean, Evaldi pitched in the American League East as well, so he kind of had a plan. But the other guys, it was all bullpen. And Tampa and Baltimore hadn't seen it or hadn't had a lot of familiarity with it. And therefore, they did it the old school way. You don't see us much. We take advantage of that. And that's why, again, I prefer the 80s and 90s sports to today. Because in the 80s and 90s sports, there wasn't 75 games against every division. You didn't play everybody 65 times. You played one series on the East Coast, one series on the West Coast, and you hope that if you met in the playoffs, they would forget what they learned about you, and you obviously hoped to remember what you learned about them. And so when the Mets played the Dodgers in '88, the Mets thought it was going to be a cakewalk because the Mets had beaten them 11 out of 12 times on the East Coast and the West Coast. Didn't matter what coast. They just beat the brakes off of them. And it was up 3-1 in the series. But then something changed. The Dodgers got that memorable home run from Socha, got Hershiser back on the mound, and it was lights out. But when it's divisional opponents, it's harder because you face them more. And so I'm attributing that more to why the Braves, the Dodgers, and the Giants have been eliminated because prior to this season, they played 19 games a season against the team that knocked them out. And that's why last year's was shocking because the Braves had a terrible beginning at the beginning of the season and then caught fire and then cooled and then the Phillies beat them. But I think the season series was not pretty far apart like the Dodgers and the Padres was. The Dodgers won like 15 out of 19 games. Like they killed them. And when they met in the playoffs, the Padres turned the tables. The previous year with the Giants and the Dodgers played 19 times, and I think the Giants won 10-9. So that series was going to go either way, and it did. Went to the last game, Game 5. So I'm not ascribing a trend. I'm just saying, in terms of National League, the National League teams have lost who were favored because of familiarity. The American League teams have won because of unfamiliarity. And I prefer the 80s and 90s sports to that because in the 80s and 90s sports, for some weird reason, no, not really a weird reason, but September, there wasn't really any matchups between the division leaders. And so there was no previews. And so when it came to the postseason, it was, you don't see us, we don't see you, let's dance. Today it's, we see you, we kind of know you, or we see you and we really know you, let's dance. And for some reason, baseball thinks that's good. And they're never going to change it because of the money. And with these new rules making the games go faster, baseball's definitely not going to change it. Although the playoff games have gone over 3 hours, and almost all of them, well, I'm not paying that much attention to some of them because my team isn't in it. And some of these games have had, I'm going to digress for a second. This is why I think the baseball rules are stupid. The Phillies-Braves game the other night, where Michael Harris Jr. threw out Bryce Harper at first base, I think that game was a 3-hour game. And I guarantee you, nobody complained. Nobody complains that games are long. Fans want results. And so if it takes 66 hours to get a result, fans will stick around for the results. It's like that, what was his name, Mahout and John Isner's tennis match that lasted 2 or 3 days. Nobody cared that the match was going crazily long and the final score was 70-68 in the tiebreak in the fifth set. I mean, obviously tennis didn't change rules, but the point is that people just want results. That's it. Doesn't matter how long it takes to get the results. That's what people want. I'm sorry. Had to say that. And I promise you, Atlanta the other night wouldn't have cared if the game took 10 hours for them to come from behind because they were being dominated, and it took a couple of home runs to get them ahead, and it took an absolute unbelievable catch at the wall and an accurate throws to double off Bryce Harper. I promise you, even last night's game, there was some drama last night. I mean, the Braves scare you because it doesn't matter what the score is. They get a man on base, and you're thinking you're going to get a bloop and a blast. Texas scores a ton of runs. The Astros don't care. The Astros score runs too. Astros don't care if they're down 6-0. They believe that they can come from behind to win. And putting time constraints on games, expediting games, taking the human element out of games, to me, bad business. But baseball loves it. I'm sorry I'm talking with a lower voice today. I'm quite tired and quite hungry actually right now. And so I will end this. But basically what I'm saying, the reason why things have happened recently isn't because there are more playoff games. It's just familiarity in the National League. And in the American League, I think the reason why we've had longer series, good series, is they don't know each other as well. Although now we have Houston versus Texas. Texas was probably playing the best baseball at the beginning of the season to the almost end. I mean, we know Tampa was the best team in the beginning, but then Texas was also keeping pace until they met. Houston got hot once all their players came back. And then they re-signed Verlander, Verlander got traded back to them from the Mets. And so we're going to see if familiarity does anything, because apparently during the regular season, Houston won 9 out of 13 games. So we'll see if Texas can turn it around or not. In the National League now, we have Philadelphia against Arizona. So it's the exact opposite. Now you have in the National League Philadelphia and Arizona, who don't play against each other that much. In the American League, you have Houston versus Texas. What does America want to see? For me, I'd like to see Texas and I'd like to see Arizona. I can never root for the Phillies, except for when they play against the Braves. But will America watch that? Texas versus Arizona World Series? I think America wants Corey Seager to go against Bryce Harper, or a rematch of last year's World Series, which was exciting for some moments, but I digress again. But thank you for listening to me on this Friday the 13th. I hope your day goes very, very well. I'm Richard Harris.